Did you know that Black Africans were never feared because of violence, but because of their strength, unity, and culture? For centuries, European colonizers twisted history, erased achievements, and tried to paint resilience as danger. From music and traditions to literature and knowledge, everything that reminded Black people of their identity was seen as a threat. But the truth could never be silenced, and today, we uncover the hidden story they didn't want you to know. If you found this story powerful, hit that subscribe button and stay tuned for more real history. And tell me in the comments, which state are you watching from? When Europeans first came into contact with African societies, fear did not come from violence, but from misunderstanding. African civilizations were very different from Europe, and instead of trying to understand those differences, many outsiders judged them through their own narrow mindset. What they did not recognize, they began to fear. Africa was not a land without structure, as colonizers later claimed. There were organized kingdoms, strong leaders, trade networks, laws, and deep cultural traditions. Communities valued collective living, respect for elders, and spiritual balance. But European observers often measured everything by their own standards. If something did not look European, they assumed it was inferior or dangerous. This misunderstanding quickly turned into suspicion. African people were physically strong, confident, and deeply connected to their land and culture. Rather than seeing this strength as normal, colonizers interpreted it as a threat. They believed that people who were united, proud, and self-sufficient would be difficult to control. Fear slowly replaced curiosity. Language barriers made the situation worse. African histories were passed down orally through storytelling, songs, and rituals. Europeans, who depended heavily on written records, dismissed these traditions as unreliable or meaningless. Because they could not read African history in books, they claimed it did not exist. This false belief helped justify their growing fear. Religion and spirituality were also misunderstood. African spiritual practices were deeply symbolic and community-centered. Instead of trying to learn their meaning, colonizers labeled them as dark, evil, or savage. These labels made it easier to portray African people as dangerous and in need of control. Over time, misunderstanding became intentional. Fear was useful. It allowed colonizers to spread the idea that African societies were chaotic and violent, even when evidence showed otherwise. This fear-based narrative helped justify invasion, domination, and later, enslavement. The birth of fear was not natural, it was created. It grew from ignorance, cultural arrogance, and the refusal to see Africans as equals. By misunderstanding African life, Europeans convinced themselves that Black Africans were a threat. This false belief became the foundation for centuries of oppression, shaping how Black people were viewed long after colonial rule began. This is where the story truly starts, not with danger, but with a misunderstanding that changed history. As European control over African lands increased, the story of Africa began to change, but not by accident. Colonizers did not just take land and resources, they also took control of history. To justify their actions, they started rewriting African history in ways that benefited them. What followed was not truth, but a carefully shaped narrative. Africa had long histories of powerful kingdoms, skilled rulers, legal systems, trade routes, and knowledge in science, medicine, and architecture. However, these facts did not support the idea that Africans needed to be civilized, so colonizers ignored them or erased them completely. Instead, they painted Africa as a land without history, order, or progress before European arrival. This rewritten history was spread through books, schools, churches, and government records. European writers described Africans as backward and uncultured, while presenting themselves as saviors and teachers. By doing this, they made colonial rule seem necessary and even helpful. The truth was hidden behind false storytelling. One of the biggest tools used was selective documentation. European historians wrote about African societies only after colonization, refusing to acknowledge what existed before. Oral traditions, which carried centuries of history, were dismissed as myths. Because African knowledge was not written in European languages or styles, it was labeled unreliable. Maps were redrawn, timelines were altered, and African achievements were credited to outsiders. Ancient cities, trade empires, and inventions were either ignored or claimed to be influenced by Europe or the Middle East. This slowly removed Africans from their own story. By rewriting history, colonizers also reshaped identity. Generations of Black Africans were taught that their ancestors had achieved nothing before foreign rule. This damaged self-worth and made resistance harder. When people are disconnected from their past, they are easier to control. This false version of African history did not just affect Africa, it spread across the world and became widely accepted as fact. Even today, many people unknowingly repeat these lies. Rewriting African history was not about ignorance, it was about power. Controlling the past meant controlling the present. By changing the story of Africa, colonizers strengthened their rule and deepened the fear-based image of Black Africans as inferior and threatening. The damage of this manipulation lasted far beyond colonialism, shaping how Black history is still understood today. As African history was rewritten, another powerful step followed: the complete ignoring of Black history and Black literature. This silence was not accidental, it was a strategy. By removing Black voices from records, books, and education systems, colonizers made it easier to control how the world saw Black people. Black Africans had always preserved knowledge through storytelling, poetry, proverbs, songs, and community memory. These were not simple stories. They carried lessons about leadership, morality, resistance, and survival. But because this knowledge was not written in European-style books, it was treated as worthless. Colonizers claimed that if something was not written in their language, it did not count as history. As time passed, schools controlled by colonial powers taught only European achievements. African thinkers, writers, and leaders were left out completely. Children grew up learning about European philosophers and explorers, while never hearing the names of their own intellectual ancestors. This created a dangerous gap between Black people and their identity. When Black literature did begin to appear in written form, it was often censored, dismissed, or attacked. Stories that spoke about suffering, slavery, and colonial violence were labeled as emotional, exaggerated, or rebellious. Truth became uncomfortable for those in power, so it was pushed aside. This rejection of Black literature helped spread the idea that Black people had no voice or independent thought. It made oppression appear natural. Without written proof in official systems, colonizers claimed that Black Africans had contributed nothing to human knowledge. This lie was repeated so often that it started to feel real. The impact was deep and long-lasting. Generations were raised without access to their own stories. Without history and literature, people struggled to understand who they are and where they come from. This weakened unity and confidence, which was exactly the goal. Yet, even in silence, Black history survived. Stories were whispered in homes, songs carried hidden meanings, and elders passed down truth from memory. Despite attempts to erase it, Black literature lived on in many forms. Ignoring Black history and literature was one of the most powerful tools of control. It did not just erase the past, it tried to shape the future. But the truth never fully disappeared. It waited, ready to be rediscovered and told again. As colonial rule and enslavement spread, the main goal of those in power became very clear: control. Land, labor, and resources were important, but controlling identity was even more powerful. Anything that reminded Black Africans of who they were before oppression was seen as dangerous. Colonial systems depended on obedience. To keep people obedient, colonizers worked to break confidence and self-worth. They used harsh laws, punishments, and fear to weaken the spirit. But even more damaging was the constant message that Black Africans were inferior, uncivilized, and needed guidance. Over time, this message was meant to feel normal. Yet identity refused to disappear. Families continued traditions in secret. Names, languages, rituals, and beliefs survived quietly. These small acts of remembrance were powerful because they kept a sense of self alive. To those in power, this was a threat. A person who remembers who they are is harder to fully control. Cultural expressions became closely watched. Music, spiritual gatherings, and community meetings were often restricted or banned. Colonizers feared these moments because they created unity. Unity led to communication, and communication could lead to resistance. Even a simple song or prayer was seen as a possible act of rebellion. Religion was also used as a tool of control. African spiritual beliefs were labeled as evil or backward, while foreign beliefs were forced as superior. This was not about faith, it was about replacing identity. If Black Africans accepted the idea that their traditions were wrong, they might accept oppression more easily. Power structures survived by creating distance between people and their roots. The less people knew about their culture, the easier they were to dominate. This is why identity itself became dangerous. Pride was seen as defiance. Memory was seen as rebellion. The fear was never about violence, it was about awareness. Those in power understood that once Black Africans fully recognized their shared history, strength, and value, the system built on exploitation would begin to crack. This is why control went beyond chains and weapons. It entered the mind. The battle was not only for land or labor, but for identity. And the fact that Black Africans continued to hold on to who they were, even in the darkest conditions, proved that identity could not be fully destroyed. Even under extreme oppression, Black Africans showed remarkable resilience, and it was this very strength that frightened those in power. Slavery, colonial rule, and systemic racism were designed to break people physically, mentally, and spiritually. Yet, time and again, Black Africans found ways to survive, resist, and preserve their dignity. This resilience was not violent by default. It was about survival, unity, and holding on to identity. Communities adapted to harsh conditions while keeping traditions alive. Families passed down stories of ancestors, heroic deeds, and cultural practices, often in secret. These acts were small but powerful. Each story, song, and ritual reinforced pride, courage, and knowledge. To colonial rulers who wanted complete control, this quiet resistance was dangerous. It proved that African people could endure and maintain strength despite brutal systems designed to destroy them. Revolts and escapes were another form of resilience. Even though punishments were severe, enslaved Africans refused to accept captivity silently. They organized rebellions, formed secret networks, and sometimes even escaped to create independent communities. Each act of resistance spread fear among colonizers, reinforcing the idea that Black Africans were a threat. Their survival skills, intelligence, and courage challenged the false narrative that they were weak or inferior. Resilience also showed in cultural persistence. African languages, spiritual practices, and music survived, often adapting to new environments. These cultural expressions became a source of strength, teaching communities unity, hope, and patience. They reminded everyone that oppression could never fully erase identity. European powers feared this because control depended on erasing not just freedom, but memory, pride, and culture. Even education and self-improvement were seen as threats. Whenever Black Africans learned to read, write, or gain knowledge, it challenged the imposed system of inequality. Education empowered people to question injustice, share ideas, and lead communities. This intellectual and social resilience was viewed as dangerous because it created leaders who could inspire change. Ultimately, resilience was more than survival. It was a quiet rebellion that could not be silenced. The strength of Black Africans was never about harming others. It was about preserving humanity, culture, and dignity in the face of immense oppression. And it was precisely this unwavering resilience that colonizers feared most, because no weapon, law, or punishment could erase the identity of people determined to survive and thrive. This resilience laid the foundation for generations to come, proving that strength, unity, and pride were greater threats to oppression than any army or ruler could ever be. Black culture became a powerful form of resistance, even when the people creating it faced oppression every day. Music, spirituality, and traditions were not just ways to celebrate life, they were tools to survive, communicate, and maintain identity. For those in power, this was threatening because it reminded Black Africans of their strength and unity. Music played a key role. Songs were more than entertainment, they were messages. Enslaved people often used songs to share information about escape routes, warn of danger, or encourage each other during hard work. Spirituals and chants carried stories of freedom, hope, and resilience, connecting generations across time. Even when authorities tried to ban gatherings or singing, these songs survived, spreading courage and solidarity. Spirituality was another strong force. African religious beliefs centered on community, ancestors, and respect for nature. These practices provided comfort, guidance, and a sense of control over one's life, even when daily reality was harsh. Spiritual ceremonies often strengthened bonds between people, reminding them they were not alone. To colonizers, this spiritual cohesion was dangerous because it created strong communities that could resist control. Traditions and rituals also preserved identity. Naming ceremonies, dances, storytelling, and craft work were passed down quietly, keeping memory alive. These traditions connected people to their history and reinforced values like honor, courage, and loyalty. They allowed Africans to maintain a sense of dignity, pride, and belonging in a world that constantly tried to strip it away. Even daily life reflected resistance. Cooking, farming, and building homes with African methods carried knowledge from ancestors. Shared meals, celebrations, and work routines created networks of support. Every small act of cultural preservation defied the attempts to erase African identity. Through culture, African communities reminded themselves and others that oppression could not destroy their spirit. Music, spirituality, and traditions became ways to survive emotionally, mentally, and socially. They were living proof that African people could endure hardship while keeping hope, pride, and strength intact. For colonial rulers, this was a constant concern. Culture empowered Black Africans in ways that weapons and laws could not. It built unity, inspired resistance, and created pride and identity. The richness of African culture became one of the strongest threats to systems built on fear, exploitation, and control, proving that survival was not just about life, it was about preserving freedom, heritage, and humanity. This shows that culture was never just for celebration. It was a shield, a weapon, and a lifeline for generations who refused to be erased. One of the greatest strengths of Black Africans was their sense of community. From families to entire villages, people relied on each other for survival, support, and guidance. This collective strength created unity that colonial powers found threatening. Unlike the individual-focused systems promoted by Europeans, African communities valued togetherness, shared responsibility, and loyalty to one another. This unity made control more difficult and frightened those in power. In daily life, collective strength was visible everywhere. Work, whether on farms or in households, was shared. Knowledge was shared between generations through storytelling, songs, and practical lessons. Elders guided the young, passing on wisdom about survival, history, and moral values. When one person struggled, the community stepped in. This solidarity created resilience that could not easily be broken by laws, violence, or oppression. The thread was not only in survival, but in organization. Groups could plan, communicate, and resist together. Secret networks, mutual aid societies, and community gatherings allowed people to support each other, and at times challenge unjust systems. Colonial authorities feared these networks because they enabled people to resist collectively rather than individually. A united community could never be fully controlled. Even celebrations, festivals, and rituals strengthened this bond. They were not merely entertainment. They reminded people of shared values, history, and identity. Music, dance, and storytelling became ways to reinforce pride, courage, and knowledge. These cultural practices created invisible bonds between people who were physically separated by oppression. Colonial rulers tried many ways to break collective strength. Families were separated, communities were monitored, and gatherings were often restricted. Yet, despite these efforts, unity survived. Shared hardships and common struggles only made communities closer. Those in power recognized that the more connected people were, the harder it was to dominate them. This collective strength also challenged European ideas of superiority. African communities showed intelligence, organization, and resourcefulness in ways that contradicted stereotypes of weakness or inferiority. They proved that strength was not just physical, it was social, emotional, and cultural. The power of unity sent a clear message. Black Africans were not easily defeated. Their communities were resilient, their bonds strong, and their spirit unbroken. This collective strength became one of the most feared aspects of African society because it was impossible to destroy completely. Even when individuals were oppressed, the community ensured that hope, knowledge, and pride lived on. Ultimately, collective strength made Black Africans more than survivors. They became a force that could challenge oppression and inspire future generations to fight for freedom and justice. Even after centuries of oppression, Black Africans continued to fight back in ways that went beyond physical resistance. One of the most powerful tools they had was literature. Through writing, stories, and poetry, Black people began to reveal the truth about slavery, colonial violence, and racial discrimination, truths that those in power had tried to hide. This truth-telling became a threat because it exposed the lies that justified oppression. Black writers shared experiences that were ignored or erased in official histories. They told stories of families torn apart, communities struggling under unfair laws, and the everyday courage of people who refused to give up. Their words showed the strength, intelligence, and resilience of Black Africans, challenging centuries of false narratives that painted them as weak or inferior. Literature also created awareness within communities. People who read or heard these works were reminded of their shared history, culture, and struggles. These stories inspired pride, unity, and determination. Knowledge, after all, is power. When Black Africans knew their own history, they could resist manipulation and reclaim their identity. This made colonial powers nervous because truth and unity were far more dangerous than weapons. Books, essays, and poems became a form of resistance. Even when authorities tried to censor or ban them, the ideas spread. Secret readings, circulating manuscripts, and oral retellings ensured that knowledge reached those who needed it most. This created networks of informed, empowered people who were ready to challenge injustice whenever possible. The impact of Black literature went beyond individual empowerment. It shaped movements, inspired leaders, and laid the groundwork for social change. Writers not only recorded the past, but also envisioned a future where equality, dignity, and freedom could exist. These words were a threat because they encouraged action, thought, and awareness, things oppressive systems fear most. Importantly, this literature proved that the perceived danger of Black Africans was never about violence or aggression. It was about knowledge, identity, and the refusal to accept lies. Telling the truth about oppression made people powerful and unafraid, threatening the systems built on fear, ignorance, and control. In the end, Black literature showed that ideas could never be silenced. stories carried hope, courage, and resistance across generations. By speaking the truth, Black Africans ensured that their culture, history, and identity could survive and inspire future generations. What colonizers feared most was not rebellion itself, but the awakening of minds and the realization that a people who know their worth cannot truly be controlled. This power of words, knowledge, and truth marked the final chapter in the story of fear, showing that the greatest threat to oppression has always been the strength and resilience of the human spirit.